Thank you for coming to my presentation. This is N.A.S.ty systems that store network accessible shells. I'm sure you can guess that the name comes from the network storage devices that I've assessed. My name is Jacob Holcomb. I'm a security analyst at Independent Security Evaluators. We're a US-based company out of Baltimore, Maryland. Again, I'm an analyst, and why do I do this stuff? Because I love exploiting computer code. So, is the information I'm going to share with you today really important? Absolutely, and for a couple of reasons. The first being that 100% of the devices that I evaluated were vulnerable to exploitation. And what I mean by that is I was able to execute some form of code or commands on all 10 devices that I've looked at, ranging from a $200 device all the way up to a several $1,000 device. One thing that's unique about storage systems versus, let's say, routers is that the manufacturers will develop one operating system. Just as an example here, let's just say N.A.S.ty operating system 6. And that software will be used across an entire product line. So it's likely that if you find a vulnerability in one N.A.S. system, it's going to affect the entire product line made by that manufacturer. In the case of Netgear, I looked at an $800 device, and the vulnerabilities I found affected their devices all the way up to $25,000 or $30,000. So, yeah. The next being is storage systems, embedded device systems have been plagued with vulnerabilities for ages. A lot of the code base that's used in these systems has been around since the late 80s, early 90s. So this code will be disseminated to these manufacturers from chipset manufacturers. And they'll kind of tweak it, to their needs to make a working system. And these systems can and are being exploited in the wild by remote malicious malware, as was the case with like the Moonworm, for instance, and then most recently, shell shock affected QNAP NASs. People were exploiting this in the wild for profit. There was another instance where Synology NAS platforms were actually affected by an old vulnerability, but it was ransomware, to where it would exploit the device and then encrypt the file system and require users to pay money before they would be given the decryption key. So really quick, the company I work for is N.A.S.ty. This is who we are. We're just a bunch of hackers. We break stuff. And we do it for Fortune 500 enterprises and predominantly the media and entertainment industry. Our perspective is primarily white box. We prefer to do kind of like the black box assessment of a piece of software and then been given design documentation and possibly source code to further uncover any potential vulnerabilities. So these are the topics we're going to cover today. What are network storage devices? The name is pretty obvious. Some of the key players, the functionality offered, my exploit research and development. When I presented at Black Hat USA, I talked about this research as I'm currently in the midst of performing and concluding my project. But I demonstrated individual vulnerabilities in a series of devices. Today I'm actually going to demonstrate a weaponized version of those vulnerabilities, where I took several exploits that I have for 3 devices, which I have here on stage, and rolled them into a software package that is essentially self-replicating. So I've developed a proof of concept worm for these devices. We're then going to talk about the absence of security and other systems and some steps for remediation. So really quick subject background. These devices are primarily used for data retention. Really any internet-based service that you use today, Gmail, if it's email, virtualization, if it's a desktop that you have access to over the internet, it's using some form of back-end network storage. Some users are anyone from small businesses and home users all the way up to, like I said, large enterprises. So here are some of the key players in the market. Under the vendors bullet, I did not evaluate products from every one of these vendors, but most of them I did. So a list of the products that I've evaluated. I haven't published any of the vulnerabilities publicly. I've actually been trying to take extensive steps to work with the manufacturers and remediating these issues due to the possibility for mass exploitation and the fact that these devices have been exploited in the wild. Okay, so system functionality. In addition to just storing files, these systems have a plethora of network services, and those services range from simple telnet and FTP servers all the way to web servers that have their own instances of PHP and WordPress. So really, it's in addition to it storing files, it's like a little server, and whether or not the applications are beneficial to like end users for serving files or websites or not, all of these systems have some form of unnecessary service that's running for at least management purposes. The biggest unnecessary service or functionality offered by some of these devices is the cloud feature. When I say cloud feature, yes, it's a buzzword, but I'm referring to these devices facilitating remote access without the need for NAT, meaning that they make an outbound connection to a third party, being the manufacturer's platform, whatever it may be, and then you'll access their platform, which will then give you access to your files. So they act as the man in the middle, so to speak, for data access. So exploit research and development. These are some of the things we'll talk about today. I'm going to give you a brief summary of my results, quickly talk about the testing methodology, which involves scanning and enumeration, vulnerability discovery, and then the exploitation of discovered vulnerabilities, and then the mass exploitation. I like worms, baby, and exploit demos. So the exploit demos and mass exploitation kind of tie together. As this time, as I stated, I'm doing a worm demonstration instead of individual demos, but when we get into absence of security section, I have a different device that I will exploit today. So preliminary results. As I stated, 100% of the devices are susceptible to root compromise. At least 50% of them, as of right now, can be exploited without authentication, meaning that I can exploit them by performing an authentication bypass, or there's an authorization bug where pages rendered to end users do not require authentication to access, and they contain vulnerabilities. So at this time, I have received 22 CVE numbers from MITR. That's in contrast to the 56 CVEs I received last year for publishing Soho router vulnerabilities. I'm up to about 30 vulnerabilities. I just haven't requested CVEs for them, and I am fairly confident that by the end of my research, I will have surpassed the 56 CVE mark that I achieved while researching routers. Hence the far worse than routers bullet. All right, so testing methodology. We're going to cover these steps. Scanning and enumeration. It's your simple, port scan, discovering what's running on the box by default. When I evaluated these, I basically was making an assumption that any of the extra features that were not installed by default, end users weren't using. So far when I've started looking at these systems, I haven't evaluated any of those features. It's pretty much what comes out of the box. So here I just have some nmap syntax that was used to discover open ports. And then as we know, you can't always trust the output of a port scan, so I have an image of Netcat there, basically connecting to port 8080 and confirming that it is indeed an HTTP server. So vulnerability discovery. Basically, if you have a system running network services and you want to probe to determine whether or not vulnerabilities exist, you have to take several steps. And those steps being investigate any running port that's on the system. Once a port has been determined to be open, you as an attacker or a researcher need to understand what's running on that port, how to communicate with the device on said port. If you determine that there is a port open and it's serving a web application, you need to be familiar with the web application, what types of languages are used on the server side, and the client side. Static code analysis. A lot of the software used on these systems and other embedded electronics are using GPL or any form of open source software code base, which means that you can go out to the manufacturer's website and in most cases download all of the code. Not all of the code, but most of the code that runs on these systems. And actually, you'll kind of find that a lot of the code that they don't include appears to be the most vulnerable. Maybe they do that on purpose. I don't know. And then, of course, dynamic analysis. If you don't have source code, or even if you do, I like to do them simultaneously because it helps me. I feel I get more coverage during my audit. If I throw a fuzzer at a port, once I know the protocol and how to operate with the port or interact with the port, I will then review source code as well. So the fuzzer will work, and then I'll work and look at source code. So dynamic analysis is absolutely imperative to any application security assessment. Here are the types of vulnerabilities I've discovered. If you've noticed, I haven't looked for a lot of like the common things that you would find in OWASP. For instance, injection vulnerabilities like SQL injection, more or less, cross-site scripting and things of that nature. Any less severe vulnerability, like an information disclosure, I found as a result of looking for issues that would allow me to execute code. So I've been strictly trying to find vulnerabilities that an attacker could leverage to assume full control of the system. That's what my research has been about. So I mentioned backdoors, I believe, in the last list. I found a couple of them, but the one that I'm highlighting specifically is in the Seagate device. There's actually an undocumented backdoor user on the system that they don't talk about, and I have it highlighted here as the shadow file, and as you can see, there's an old descrypt password. We all know how secure DES is, meaning that this user has access to the entire system. You can access any management interface, including the web interface, and don't quote me on this, but I believe Telnet was open by default, meaning that if you have this account and you're able to access port 23 or 80 TCP, you had access to the system. Okay, what does that do for you? Well, it gives you access to the management interface. You can change, DNS settings. Okay, that's all fine and dandy, but you don't have a root shell. Well, again, the system is vulnerable to a command injection vulnerability. You have this user account, you can exploit that command injection vulnerability, which gives you root access. Another great thing, this is kind of a crypto-based bug. This was an N.A.S.ty device, and they had a session cookie. Okay, good for them. It's using PHP, but little did I know is they were generating their cookies insecurely. And how were they doing that? Well, they were using time as a seed. So here, I basically took a bunch of cookies, made 20,000 requests, and I kind of wanted to determine the effective entropy pool of the generated cookie. And the analysis tool in Burp indicated that the effective entropy was about 2 bits, which is absolutely terrible. For instance, today for password security, NIST recommends at least 80 bits of security to be cryptographically secure. So this is highly insecure. So it's hard for you guys to see, but right here I have a sample of the cookies, and the high order bits actually have 53DF. Those 2 bytes are important for an upcoming slide, so just remember 53DF. So here are some more charts, kind of discussing or demonstrating or showing the entropy of the cookie. The cookie was 16 characters long, and as you can see here, character 15 and 16 change the most frequent, while some of the earlier characters do not. And if you were thinking of some value, that may have some form of repetitive pattern, with consistency, the first thing that comes to mind is time. It's sequential. So quickly here, to kind of, see if my thought process was, in line and correct, I just wrote up some quick C code here to initialize a time val struct. And I'm calling get time of day and passing it that struct to basically see the total number of seconds since epoch. So when I compile and run this code, as you can see, seconds in hex, 53DF. 53DF is what we saw in the session cookies. That's indicative of time being used to see the generation of cookies, which makes them highly insecure, meaning that an attacker can effectively, within a deterministic amount of time or an easily achievable amount of time, guess and generate cookies of active sessions, which means you've, again, assumed control of this system. So vulnerability exploitation. We're going to talk about command injection, missing function level access control. And that's kind of a vague term, but it's something that OWASP, started talking about. And I like to kind of keep terminology in line with, what's standard out there, just so people, aren't throwing around all of these various terms and, all that jazz. Specifically, we're going to talk about authentication bypass and authorization bypass. So while these two issues are similar, they are different. Authentication, meaning that you've effectively bypassed authentication and you're able to access resources that you should not have access to. Authorization, meaning that it requires authentication, but the developer forgot to perform the necessary privilege checks, so maybe an unprivileged user can perform an administrative action. And then stack-based buffer overflows. Code execution is my absolute favorite. Command injection is just as good, but I'll tell you what, there's nothing like sitting in a debugger for hours and just looking at lines upon lines of memory. I'm a nerd. All right, so command injection. Really quick, just a definition. It's basically when you can execute operating system commands. I'm going to keep some of the stuff brief because I want to make sure we have time for the demos. I've been going for about 15 minutes, so I think we're good. Some countermeasures. So developers, this is important. End users basically have no defense against this. It is up to you to basically quit sucking. No, that's really not what it is. A lot of it comes down to education and awareness. So that's why, I like to give these talks. I like to inform individuals on how to make more secure software. That's my mission. So avoid calling shell commands when possible. A lot of the time there's an API provided for you that you can use in a secure way instead of calling, let's say, system, or execve, basically any function or method, depending on the type of language you're working with, that executes system commands. If an API does not exist, two solutions. One, develop one yourself and test it thoroughly. And two, if you have to absolutely use user input in a function like system, make sure it's properly sanitized and validated. Do not take a blacklist approach. Always go whitelist. Always say, I want this input exactly, and if the input supply does not match A, B, or C, reject it. So missing function level access control, I briefly gave a description. Yes, the picture. It's the absence of server-side authorization checks, essentially. So again, very simple. Just perform authentication and authorization checks. If there's a resource that needs authentication, make sure that they have a valid session cookie or some form of authenticated method that you are requiring them to have. And then authorization checks. If there's administrator functionality and several different privilege levels, ensure that each is properly segmented and that they can only access the required resources for their privilege level. Buffer overflow, like I said, my favorite. Basically, depending on where you're overflowing, whether it's in the heap or the stack, this will differ, but you always have a fixed size buffer, which essentially is a region of memory, and more data is put into that buffer than what was allocated, which would then, by virtue of that, overwrite adjacent memory and cause data corruption, which in most cases will give the attacker control of the application's program flow. So this is a screenshot of me debugging a buffer overflow vulnerability on one of the N.A.S.ty systems. I will not be presenting this one today, but it does exist, and the source code or the exploit code will be released sometime in the future. I have no idea, but sometime. I still owe a paper. My boss is getting on me for that. So some countermeasures. Don't use unsafe functions. We know some of the big names, strcpy, memcopy, sprintf. Just because you use strncopy or snprintf does not mean that you're actually, you've prevented a buffer overflow. I can't tell you how many times I've gone through source code and I've seen people use strncopy wrong, to where they're actually saying, oh, copy this data into this buffer, but copy the size of the supplied data into the buffer instead of at most the size of the buffer. So you're essentially just passing an extra argument to strncopy when it's really just a strcopy. And then perform bounds checking, which is again just ensuring that no more data is copied to the buffer than what was allocated. and compile/link with overflow prevention techniques. And the big things are canary and stat cookies, ASLR, and data execution prevention, or non-executable, which is in GDB is enabled by default, and I believe it is in Visual Studio, but don't quote me on that. I'm a Linux fan here. So mass exploitation, the N.A.S.ty worm. I've been trying to come up with a clever name for this. I failed miserably, so I'm just calling it N.A.S.ty worm. I'm going to exploit 3 devices today with this worm, the D-Link N.A.S.345, the TreadNet TN200, and the Western Digital MyCloud EX4. And they're actually on the stage up here. For those of you in the back, you can't see them, but if you're curious what they look like, they are up here. You can come see them in a little bit. Similar occurrences, I've talked about them, but just to quickly recap, Linksys, the moonworm, that was the device or the worm that exploited Linksys devices that leveraged command injection vulnerability. The QNAP shell shock worm, which was discovered in the wild by FireEye. I'm not sure if that's still running rampant on the web, but it's very possible. And then I mentioned the Synology ransomware that encrypted the file system. So this is how my worm operates. Basically, it looks for open TCP/80. If it finds port TCP/80 open, it is then going to perform a fingerprint. And it does that by making a series of requests and parsing the responses based on the data received from the port 80, the server running on port 80. It determines if it's one of these 3 systems. If it determines that the port 80 is running on a vulnerable target, it exploits it. Once it's been exploited using a command injection vulnerability, it downloads and runs a copy of itself. Once the copy has been run, then the process just rinse and repeats. So the D-Link exploit is kind of a fun one. It's command injection with an authentication bypass. Some of the challenges with this vulnerability in developing the exploit was the fact that there was no interactive shell. So for the purpose of my worm, the only thing that I'm doing is exploiting a target and then opening up a telnet, an unauthenticated telnet on a various port that I've specified in the exploit code, and then telling it to exploit others. So with no interactive shell, how am I going to have a shell on telnet? Well, what I did was actually create a shell script on the system, a couple bytes at a time, that basically listened for user input and then echoed that input, and then it was in an infinite loop. So I created a pseudo shell, so to speak, and I used that as my shell. So that got around the fact that I had no interactive shell. And then I was able to essentially have the unauthenticated telnet server and full root access. So that was a win. Fun little trick. The TreadNet exploit. Again, command injection and authentication bypass. The challenge here was limited space for commands. So I was injecting into a field, I believe, where there was an IP address, and this system would only allow me to include a couple of bytes for each command. Well, there was no way that I was going to, tell the system to do everything I wanted. I couldn't even spawn a telnet shell with a couple command injection vulnerabilities. So what I did was create, again, a shell script on the file system, but I literally did this 2 bytes at a time. So I execute about 100 different commands by just echoing data into a file, and then for each subsequent command, it's just appending to that file. And then once it's been fully written, we execute it. So this one takes a while to exploit, but I circumvent the challenge of limited space for commands in my payload. The Western Digital exploit. This one was face roll. So basically, it was a device that had a command injection vulnerability in it. But it was in a page that wasn't intended to be exposed in the web root. It does not require authentication. And it's actually PHP code. I forget the vulnerable function, what they were using to execute commands, but that's irrelevant for this demonstration. And all I had to do is call it directly, and I could put in whatever data I want. So it's just one command, and then all I do is win. So the worm demo. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go over to my VM, and I'm going to show you that I am unable to telnet into the 3 systems that we're going to exploit today. And then I'm going to launch the worm. and we'll talk about it while it runs. I think the first device that gets exploited is the TrendNet device, so it will definitely take a while. So there's 3 systems, the first of which is 10.4242. As you can see, we're unable to connect. The next system is 1.10. As you can see, we're unable to connect. The next system is 1.20. Wait, hold on a second here. 1.10. I actually messed that up. That should be 1.15. I apologize. Okay, we're unable to connect. And then this one is 1.20. As you can see, trying, okay, we haven't connected. We're unable to connect. So what we're going to do now is actually exploit these systems. And sorry, my resolution's all whacked. I'm trying to find, gosh darn it. All right, here we go. And you guys can't read that. We're not going to talk about it. That's just some of the fingerprint code. I was going to show you the requests that were going to be sent during the test. So let's see, let's zoom in. Okay, you guys can read that okay? Okay, so this is the worm. As you can see, 192.168.1.1 error finding version information, meaning it had port 80 open, but it was unable to determine that it was, or no, it determined that it was a one of the devices not included in my worm. So it is not a vulnerable NAS system. And we're just going to go through various IP addresses until we find a port 80. Here we go. 1.10, firmware version 1.0 detected. This device is the TrendNet. So we're exploiting the TrendNet device right now. And this is going to take a while. It's about 100 requests, like I said. Once the system is exploited, I'm going to kill this instance of the worm. The TrendNet device should be now compromised. I will telnet to it, and I will show you that I'm running a binary on the worm, or on the device called GDB. That's what I named my worm. I have no idea why. It's just what I decided to call it when I was developing it, and I never recompile it again with my cross compiler. And I will show you N.A.S.ty output, which actually will show it sending SYN packets to various IP addresses, which is indicating that it is now running the code and it is scanning for vulnerable systems. Once it finds one, this process that we see here is actually going to, like I said, repeat. And it will go through, and we will see that all 3 of these systems will eventually be exploited. I did not implement any code that checks if a system was exploited or not. So basically, it's kind of like the Morris worm, where it'll go around out on the internet. It finds a port 80. If it's vulnerable, then it exploits it. So multiple copies will be running on the system, which means you will have large amounts of network traffic, large amounts of ARP traffic, meaning that you could use substantial bandwidth. And this is over 3 devices. Once they're all infected, we'll kind of look at Wireshark, and we'll see the amount of traffic flowing over this small network that I have here, consisting again of 3 devices. Just think if we had tens upon tens of thousands of these systems, if not hundreds, thousands of these systems. I mean, you would essentially have a very large and powerful botnet, and with such great power, you could cause serious harm. Just imagine being able to take down parts of the internet infrastructure. And like I said, last year I performed research on Soho routers. All of those systems, those exploits could be tied into this worm as well. And now you're targeting NAS systems, you're targeting worms. You could target any system that you want and control them in a botnet. These systems don't run AV. They aren't using the latest memory protections to prevent buffer overflows. They're using outdated code and just all in all poor design practices, which makes them great targets for attackers. Forget attacking computer systems these days. These are the devices that will be exploited in the future because they give you direct access to a network, and from there you can now launch further attacks on people, whether they're client-side attacks against browsers that now gives you access to the computer. These are going to be the stepping point into any network. So, as Dan Gear said during the Black Hat USA keynote, he could take down the internet with this, and so could you. You definitely could. You know, people are out there, they're monetizing off the fact that these systems are highly vulnerable. So it's absolutely critical that we take action in securing them and urging developers at these large manufacturers to come up with a great quality assurance process and secure development lifecycle to ensure code is secure moving forward. So we're almost done. Then the TrendNet will have been successfully exploited. That's if the demo gods don't decide to rain hell on me. Okay, so exploit has been completed. We're just going to quickly stop that. Let me find that telnet window. That was 1.10. So I should be able to connect to it now. As you can see, bam, we have a shell. So if we ID it, we are root. So I've successfully received root on this. Now remember, I've told you that the process was named GDB. So if we PS and we grep for GDB, uh-oh. I think I may have forgot to start my web server, guys. I didn't? Oh yeah, thank you. I got really nervous for a second. But no, N.A.S.ty, ANTP, greps, and I don't think I started my web server. So that's going to be some total fail. Okay, so I do have gdb.tar. Okay, so what we'll do is I'm actually going to just run this again. And then while that's going, I will continue my presentation and we will come back. Let me just make sure it goes. Let me make sure I can hit my web server too. Okay, so there it is. Okay, so that's exploiting. So we'll go back to the presentation now. How am I doing on time? Does anyone know? Maybe not. All right. Well, so while the plague spreads, time for Mopone. So the case study for the Buffalo. I didn't bring the Buffalo, but this is another system that was vulnerable. This one is command injection and a unauthorized API call, meaning that it's missing its authorization check. This is a missing function level access control vulnerability. This one's a pre-recorded video, so I will go over it, and I may click through it to kind of speed it up. So what I'm doing here is logging in as the administrator user. 10 minutes? 20? Okay, great. Oh, hey, how you doing? So you can see that I've logged in here, and I have a SID value. This value is used in the JSON RPC API, which is used in all calls to the application running on the file server. So now I'm logging out. I just wanted to show you that I logged in and that we have that SID value. The admin is a default account, and there is a second default account called the guest account. And that account is used to facilitate access to files that you want to give people access to. So it's just guest and guest. I don't believe the password can be changed for this account. And you can log in, and you'll be given access to limited functionality. So they're limiting you from what you can do. And they are actually very good. You can't access other pages. You don't have the ability to arbitrarily call available APIs that are only accessible by an administrator for the most part. So as you can see here, we have a user ID of 20. That's important because we're going to use that information later. Quickly, I'm demonstrating we cannot telnet to the 1.178 address, or the 1.178, and I am showing you, again, we have the SID token. So really quick, I have this request in the burp repeater, and that's a different token that I had at one point in time. We're going to call the user.edit method, and we're going to change the password for group IDs 52. 52 was not the guest user ID that we just saw. Okay, so we called that, and invalid session ID. All right, we need to have one of these SID values. Well, I'm going to take the guest SID value, and we're going to throw it into that request and fire it off. We call it again, and result, null, bang. Okay, we have an ID now. That's completely different. Well, it seems that the device executed my request. Well, for every setting that you change, there is another request that needs to be sent, which basically is an apply settings, and that's the method we're calling here, which says, okay, anything that, any state that we just changed, apply it and then use it, from and then on. So we call that, and as you can see, we got a job ID. So bam, admin password has now been changed. We're going to log out of the guest account. We're going to then log in with the admin account using our changed password, pwned1337. Once we're logged in, we're now going to exploit the command injection vulnerability that I was unable to call without admin privileges, and we will assume full root privileges on the system. So I'm just showing you pwned1337. I copied it and pasted it just so there was no confusion as to what I was typing, and voila, we're in. So there's an authorization bug where a guest user was able to call an API that was only meant to be accessible by an admin, which gives you control of the system. So now we're just executing telnet D here in the IP address field using command substitution. And as you can see, we'll tell it to the system ID root. So we've went from the guest account all the way to root by manipulating a authorization bug and then a command injection bug. So win. All right, so next is the absence of security. In addition to these systems, like I've mentioned already, embedded electronics are plagued with vulnerabilities. Some examples are IP cameras, layer 3 routers, like the one that I have there, and we'll actually demonstrate that, exploiting that today if I don't run out of time, which that's not the focus of my talk, so if we don't get to it, it's okay. And then network storage systems. So absence of security, I mentioned 56 CVE numbers. Here are some links to the research on my company's webpage that I performed last year. There is a technical report, a vulnerability catalog that has a plethora of vulnerabilities, most of which are or have exploit code on the internet, and then just some other information about the study. So the case study, we're actually going to quickly check on the worm before we get into the exploitation of the ASUS. So it looks like we should have exploited. Yeah. So I think this was exploited. So now, hopefully, oh man, what is going on? I changed the IP addresses on these this morning. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Crap. Oops, wrong system. Wow. Apologize, guys. So I am 1.77. I'm just going to quickly check the source code that I have here. Oh, I go out to 1.6. That's why I'm such a fool. Okay, well, while I have this up, we will do the exploitation of the router, and then we'll go back to the worm. So, really quick here. We are going to exploit the N.T.N56U, which is an ASUS router. This overflow exists on any ASUS router running the ASUS WRT firmware. It is a MIPS architecture system, which means we have to use return-oriented programming to exploit it. There is limited space for memory, restricted and bad characters, and in order to exploit this, there are multiple stages of shellcode. I had to jump to the stack, perform a stack pivot, and then I am able to execute my reverse shell. So here's the vulnerable code. I'm not going to go over it for the sake of time, but I have an sprintf command, and that was the culprit of the overflow, and it took data, both apps name and apps flag. You could use either of those to trigger this overflow, and shoved it into command, which you can see is a character array of 128 bytes. So here's the ROP chain that I use to exploit this system, and this basically performs everything I said, sets up memory correctly, and allows me to execute the shellcode. Here is the reverse shellcode that I wrote for MIPS Little Indian that will allow me to gain access to the system. It's going to connect back on 1.177 on port 31337. And that's my problem, why my worm's not working. That's what my IP address was set to when I was testing this earlier. The worm's supposed to connect back to 1.106. So here's quickly the demo of that. Hopefully this won't fail me here. But we'll come over here and we will do just, netcat, listen verbosely on port 31337. We're listening. And now if we actually run this, this is a vulnerability I've published online. I haven't talked about it at a conference, so that's why I chose this one. As you can see, the CVE number is from 2013, 192.168.1.1. Oops, HTTP 192.168.1.1. Determined that it was a vulnerable target. Yes, we want to use authentication. This is an authenticated vulnerability. Now, there is a password disclosure issue on this system where you can call a page without authentication, and the JavaScript will actually return the password to you. Now, a way that you can kind of thwart an attacker from leveraging that to exploit you is change your username. It actually does not reveal the username, but it reveals the password. So, whatever. So in this case, it's admin, and the password, I believe, is ISE. So it's sending the request, and bam, connect back. So ID is an anonymous device. Gosh darn it. uname-a. As you can see there, we have a root shell. And to show you that it's root, shadow requires root access, so we can read it. So we're root on this system. That router that I have there is owned. Now, when they compile the firmware, when they compile the firmware for the various routers, the offsets of the libraries will be different, meaning that this exploit is not universal. You would actually have to get the memory address or the base address of the various libraries, change those out, and then you'd be able to exploit any system because the offsets are the same. So it's really about just determining the base address. So now, third time's the charm, right? 192.168.1.106, that's the IP address. And if we just confirm here, wget 106, gdb.tar, it's hard for you guys to see, but that's where the code is going to call out to. Oh my gosh, where is my terminal? Okay, we're going to kill my shell. And we're going to quickly just confirm that we can get to 106. And we can, great. Now we're going to run this. I want to see that it hits my target. And if it does, I will finish up the presentation so we don't run out of time. And yeah, all that jazz. So again, this is what we're just going through IP addresses until it finds a target on port 80. And as you can tell from my troubles, I'm downloading a copy of the worm for myself. For the sake of my demonstration, I decided to do that way for ease of use to ensure that there were no problems. Of course, I have a problem. I shouldn't have used two different IP addresses. That's my fault. But what I want to do, and probably will do, because I'm actually going to develop this further, is have the worm download a copy of itself from the infector. So there won't be a central server that is serving a copy of the worm. And then also code that I don't have now that I'm putting in is any device that gets infected, it's actually going to reach out and say, hey, I'm infected, you can reach me here. So I'll have some form of minor like CNC channel, but this isn't for nefarious purposes. I don't want people using it for those purposes, which I can't prevent once I release it in the wild, or sorry, provide the source code to you people. I'm not releasing it in the wild. Yeah, had to clarify. So with the exploitation of that router and talking about the absence of security in various embedded electronics, that brings me to So Hopelessly Broken. This was the name of my talk last year when I presented the router research. We kept that brand as it started to become very strong and known about. known about, and we developed a contest in partnership with the EFF. And we hosted our first event at DEF CON, and we invited researchers to come and exploit various routers and publish their findings for cash prizes and other goodies. It was a hit. People enjoyed it, so we are continuing to host them. We've done one at DerbyCon. There'll be one at B-Sides, Washington, D.C., which is actually this weekend. And in the future, TourCon. These are all USA-based conferences. If it gets big enough and there's interest, who knows, maybe we'll do it at some of the international conferences like Black Hat Europe. Remediation, really, there isn't a whole lot that you can do as a consumer. The biggest thing for vendors is to have transparent patch management. Modern operating systems these days have a way to update automatically. I understand that critical systems are not updated automatically in the enterprise setting, but that doesn't mean that they can't apply patches or at least have secure code to apply to their production systems. But the home users should have the ability to have their systems updated automatically. And then the security principles, services shouldn't be running as root. It makes it way too easy to gain root on a system. There's very little that you have to do for privilege escalation. And then it's imperative that you incorporate security into the design of your system. Don't try to bolt security on once you develop a project or a product. You need to think about it from the ground up. Okay, so thanks. That's my presentation. Really quick, we'll, I guess, check the worm, which is about done here. So fingers crossed. And while this is running, I'll talk about this, but I'll open up the floor to questions. Do I have any questions? Yes?
In terms of protection, as long as manufacturers don't improve their security for a variety of reasons, they are operating on low profit margin from these devices.
Mm-hmm.
Some initiatives to create so-called intrusion prevention or intrusion detection devices for home networks.
Yeah.
For home networks instead of enterprise networks. Is that something that could improve? Is that something that you think will take off as a potential way to secure your embedded electronics? It's not just routers, it's TVs, smart TVs, and all of those other embedded electronics that probably would have similar, right?
You're absolutely right. And while I do feel that could, help, just like any IDS or IPS, a lot of big organizations feel that, if I take this hardware appliance and I throw it in my network and I ensure that it's up to date, that there's no way that an attacker could exploit my system or get into my network. That is really a fallacy for many reasons. While there is heuristic detection and it is getting better, and it will only improve over time, it's still all signature-based, and signatures are easily bypassed. In most cases of antivirus software, a signature is a couple of bytes that are searched for within a file. And if you can alter those bytes and basically change the, let's say, MD5 sum, the signature of the file, then it will no longer be detected by antivirus software, which essentially renders those solutions useless. While they will thwart a lot of the standard attacks, they aren't bulletproof. They aren't bulletproof.
It won't protect you against targeted attacks, but it might protect you against automatic attacks or much large-scale attacks like your worm.
It could, yes, right. So my worm, they could basically figure out what I'm looking for and then build that into the system. But they can't. There's things that I could do or other attackers can do to circumvent that, by implementing forms of encryption, changing the way that my worm acts and behaves, performing a series of different, let's say, port knocking, to try and determine if an IPS is running or an IDS, and if it sees that system, it'll behave differently to circumvent its protections. While they can help, I think it's, just like any other IPS or IDS system, and it's not necessarily the end-all solution. It comes back to the developers needing to develop secure code. Just like the usage of ASLR, non-executable stack, stack cookies and canaries, does not prohibit the exploitation of memory corruption bugs, IDSs and IPSs will not prevent the exploitation of networks and software. Any other questions? I mean, you guys can see I have a GDB running now. So I have var www GDB. Yes, we do have GDB. But I'm not exploiting other systems yet. And if I grep for SYN, I don't see it. So it's very possible that I'm exploiting this very system again. Okay, so we're going to wait, because this will be the first system that exploits. So this runs, and when it downloads a copy of it itself, it runs the same code that I ran, meaning that this trendnet will be the first device exploited. It takes 100 requests. If there's currently a session open, we're not going to see the SYN that I'm looking for. But I do see that there's a fin wait here for a connection to 1.10. That's me. Yeah. Well, any more questions? Yes.
You mentioned some backdoors that you discovered or not.
Aha. Sorry to interrupt you, but there we go. There's a SYN. So now we're going to 1.7 port 80 on SYN. So the worm code is running, and it's running on this system, and it's going to continue port scanning and looking for devices. Once it finds it, it's going to then exploit them, and it will run on others. Okay, back to you. Sorry. So no, I didn't find any port knocking backdoors, but I haven't looked extensively yet. I pretty much looked at one facet of these systems, which is the web server and the applications so far. But I have found some backdoors that were in actually a system that had init scripts that started up. And if you made a certain request to a server, it made a backup copy of the password and shadow file, and then rewrote it with a new copy that actually had an undocumented user. So that's something kind of like the port knocking backdoor, but not quite.
Are the vulnerabilities exploited by this worm right now?
No. At least I haven't been notified. All of the vendors have had more than 30 days to address these issues. A lot of them have only contacted me once saying, okay, thank you for the report. We'll pass it basically up the chain to our security team, and I haven't heard anything more from them. So currently, because I don't believe that these are patch, I haven't released the individual exploit source code, and I also have not released the source code for this worm. And I probably won't, I say probably, I probably will not until they have been patched. Because it's not my goal, for people to get owned, even though I do find it kind of hilarious. Yeah, so grepping for SYN again. It is running, and it's looking at. So we should have exploited GDB. Okay, as you can see, there's 2 copies running on this guy now. And then we come over here, bam, we have a shell on 1.15. We ID it, ps grep GDB, bam, GDB is running. We come over here, whoops, hold on, this is 1.20, not 120. Maybe I haven't exploited this one yet. It is running. All right. Well, for some reason, I just fail horribly. It is 42, 42. One 192.168.1.20, 42, 42. And you guys see me hitting 1.20, 42, 42. Well, for whatever reason, my telnet isn't connecting on that one. But we can see that I never connected to 1.15 when I ran my worm. I didn't let it exploit 1.15. 1.15 has been infected twice, and it is, again, port scanning and looking for vulnerable targets. As you can see, we have a SYN. Actually, why is it going out there? We have a SYN sent. Oops. So, yeah, the worm's running on multiple systems. We can see that there's now 3 SYNs sent to different targets. I got 3 instances running on this system. We have self-propagating software here, and it works reliably against all of these devices. yeah, and I actually built it in a modularized way that makes it easy right now for me and anyone familiar with the source to tie in fingerprints, so request to fingerprint different ports, and then also exploits. The exploits I'm doing basically with the header file, which is consisting of calling a function pointer, which points to a declared function in a separate header file, and that separate header file will be an entire exploit. So I have plans to do this, whether I will or will not. Depends on my workload and my ambition in the coming months, but I'm going to continue the modularized build and maybe release it in such a way that it would be easy for people to tie in their own fingerprints and exploits and use it like a framework later. Because I feel something like this can help on penetration tests for red teamers, but I don't know if I'm going to do that for sure. It's just something that I've thought about. So if you guys are interested in anything like that, or having this modularized in a way where you can use it for your own engagements or whatever, just drop me, I don't know, a message on Twitter or email and tell me I should do it. And if I get enough people, I probably will do it. So yeah. That's it. I mean, it's running. Maybe we'll get this other guy here. I don't know why I haven't hit this one yet. Again, I changed the IP addresses, but whatever. So yeah, that's my presentation. Thanks for coming.